All right, how is everyone doing today? Welcome to my channel, and this is an educational channel where we try to probe into a lot of different issues that are pretty well hidden, but I think are pretty important. I've been doing a lot of digging over the years, and I've come across some important things that are not out there, and this is another Bible decode that we've done. We've been doing for the last 4 months or 5 months, and we have explored different avenues of decoding the Bible, the New Testament in particular. But for a while now, we've been looking at the Roman origins hypothesis, that the New Testament was written by the Romans, the Caesars, in particular the Caesars of the Flavian dynasty, and that includes Emperor Vespasian and his 2 sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian, who were rulers of the Roman Empire from 69 to 96 AD. And the basic theory is that Titus and Vespasian fought in this war, War of the Jews, 66 to 73 AD. Vespasian was the original general when the Jews expelled the Herod puppet government from Judea. And Emperor Nero called on General Vespasian to come in and quiet down the revolt. He was there for 3 years, not always just in Jerusalem, but in the Judea. But then eventually Nero was assassinated, and 3 other Roman emperors were assassinated, and then they brought in Vespasian to be the new emperor. So he stopped being the general, and he turned over the reins to his son Titus. So General Titus was fighting this war, and the story of Titus's and Vespasian's adventures, their war campaign in Judea, is documented in a book called War of the Jews. It's really 7 volumes, and it was written under the name of Josephus. Now, according to Josephus's own autobiography, and what is well accepted by all scholars, Josephus was writing from Caesar's palace at Rome, and he was an adopted member of the Flavian dynasty. He was one of the court historians to Emperor Vespasian and Titus, and Emperor Titus vociferously endorsed his 7-volume depiction of the War of the Jews. Now, if you read the War of the Jews, you will discover that it goes over the events of Titus's 3-year military campaign in Judea from 70 to 73 AD. And if you are a reader of the Bible, you will notice that the 3-year ministry of Jesus from 30 to 33 AD is exactly the same as Titus's 3-year military campaign in Judea from 70 to 73 AD. Every place that Titus goes, Jesus goes, in the same order, and the events that transpire at each location are parallels of one another. They're not exactly the same, but they are conceptually the same. And, so one example, the first example, before they even really started their respective campaigns, Jesus goes to the Sea of Galilee, and he meets Simon and Andrew on the fishing boat and convinces them to follow him. Turning your back on your father and your fishing business and follow Jesus and his ministry. And Jesus says, "Follow me and you will become fishers of men." And then exactly 40 years later, often to the very hour in these parallels, General Titus is fighting a battle on the Sea of Galilee against the Jews. And something happens with the Jewish, one of the ships, and it tips over, capsizes, or I don't know, goes under somehow. And the Jews are all in the water. And Titus orders his men, his followers, to wait for the Jews' head to get above the water so that they can pierce them with their darts or their harpoons, or else reel them in with nets. So, in other words, Titus is urging his followers to become fishers of men, literally. And that is the general pattern. Jesus says something with in a symbolic manner, and Titus echoes that same behavior literally. And it's usually quite insulting, quite mocking and ridiculing of the Jews. That's the basic idea, is that Titus, Vespasian especially, but the Romans in general, were very tired of the Jews. The Romans took over in Judea over a century before this, in 63 BC. And for the whole century, 125 years, there was one insurrection after an uprising, after a riot, after a war. The Jews were constantly fighting back against the Romans. The Romans wanted to assimilate them into their empire like they had all the other nations that were under the Romans' umbrella, through absorption. But the Jews, with their monotheistic God who was jealous and zealous and obsessive compulsive, and insisted that the Jews follow all of these very detailed and idiosyncratic rituals, including circumcision, many kosher food laws, the stricture against graven images, and animal sacrifice laws, the Passover lamb. All of these things were a pain for the Romans to manage. The Jews were just very high maintenance for the Romans. And then this war that started in 66 AD was the culmination and kind of the last straw for the Romans. And it was this revolt that it happened in 66 AD, was led by 3 Jewish zealots named Eleazar. This is according to Josephus's account. Eleazar, John, and Simon. And these people were literally Jewish messiahs. The Jews were waiting for a messiah here in the first century, according to many prophecies that were made in the Old Testament by Jewish prophets and so on. And so they were preparing and waiting for a messiah, but the messiah they were waiting for was a military leader, like Eleazar, John, and Simon, the Jewish zealots that kicked the Herods out of Jerusalem. So this literally was the arrival of the Messiah, or really 3 messiahs. And so the Romans were just tired of that. And so they decided to write a story right down their alley, because psychological warfare was one of their great strengths. Psychological operations, and they wrote a story of a Jewish Messiah who was a Prince of Peace and who believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, who believed in turning the other cheek to oppression, who believed in walking the extra mile with the Roman soldier's pack, who believed that the Roman slave owner had the greatest faith in all of Israel, and who exhorted his God to forgive the Romans, for they know not what they do. While at the same time, he goes outside the Jewish temple and overturns the tables of the Jewish money changers who were flipping Roman money, which had graven images on it, to the Jewish money, which didn't, so that they could bring it into the temple for the offering. And disrupting the Jews who were selling pigeons and doves for the animal sacrifice rituals in the temple, part of the Jewish rituals. And so this curious Jewish Messiah was peculiarly pro-Roman and anti-Jew. Go figure. Looks like a psyop, maybe. Certainly it's worth pursuing. And then when you pursue it, all the pieces fall into place, because you can see that there's a clear motive for the Romans to do this. This is right down the alley of the wheelhouse of the Romans' MO. They were always using psychological operations. Emperor Titus himself created at least 2 other religions during his very short reign. And one was of the Jews, another psyop that they used against a different group of Jews, the Pharisaic Jews, to create rabbinical Judaism, which was another diversion from this militaristic Judaism that the Romans wanted to get rid of. And the Romans had a monopoly on censorship. The Romans had a monopoly on publishing. They were the only people that had thousands of slaves that could spend all day copying texts over and over and over again. The Romans had a monopoly on the postal system. They were the only people that could distribute the Gospels all around. And the Romans characteristically wrote in Greek, the language of the New Testament. Now, the elites also used Latin, but the main language was Greek, which is quite different than what you would find in Judea. Jesus and his disciples, had they existed, would have been speaking in Aramaic with Hebrew letters, and that's what they would have been writing in. There were very few. Only the upper crust of the educated classes in Judea would have known Greek, much less written in Greek. So that is another point for the Romans. But it becomes overwhelming when you start to examine the work of Michael Menescats, which we're doing here in this survey. His new book that's called Christianity's Origins as a Flavian Secrecy Cult. Again, the Flavians were the dynasty of Caesars that we're talking about. Flavius means blonde or golden. And Josephus is also known as Flavius Josephus because he was adopted by Vespasian in a very tall tale that he tells in his autobiography. Or actually, it might actually be in War of the Jews. But what Menescats does is he recognizes the parallels of between the Jesus and Titus's ministry, but wants to find more. And Joseph Atwill has also done a lot of this work in his book Caesar's Messiah and Shakespeare's Secret Messiah, finding parallels between War of the Jews and the Gospels, in particular the New Testament in general, and has found a number of other themes beside this Jesus-Titus thing. In addition, many of the prophecies that Jesus makes are literally fulfilled by Titus. And so it sets up Titus as being the second coming of Jesus. Anybody who's looking for the second coming of Jesus, according to the book of Revelation right now, can close the book and forget about it, because if you read War of the Jews, you could see that Titus literally, according to the text, is the second coming of Jesus. Now, what they did is they wrote the story and backdated it 40 years so that they could make these prophecies that would come true. And so War of the Jews is written by the same person or people, Josephus, that wrote the Gospels. And you can see all the parallels and many different themes of the parallels. And that's what Menescott gets into. He looks at the book of Luke and War of the Jews, and he finds over 250 parallels between the two books. Some of these parallels are weak and could easily be dismissed as coincidental. Some of them are so strong that they kind of knock your socks off, especially with the level of detail and the way that they are woven into the script and incredibly well hidden. But even the ones that are weak and coincidental, you can see that they're there on purpose once you see that there are hundreds of others. And then Menescott actually charts out the 250 parallels he found on a graph. He puts the book of Luke on the vertical axis, he puts War of the Jews on the horizontal axis. Whenever he finds a parallel, he places a dot at that corresponding location. At the end of placing all 250 plus dots, he finds that he has formed 5 near-perfect letters in Latin, the language of the Roman royals. And those letters are A, P, T, V, S. The A and the P are much more weakly developed than the TVS, prompting Menescott to think that they were probably written later and possibly by a different emperor, possibly Domitian. But the TVS clearly stands for Titus Vespasianus. And this is not something that we're making up, but it's something that they actually imprinted on coins that they minted during this very period. And so it's not like, we're trying to shoehorn Titus and Vespasian into this. It's a TVS. They used the same imprint on coins. And so what this means is that not only did the Romans write the Gospels, in particular the Gospel of Luke, but they literally signed their name to it. And so if you want to reject this evidence out of hand, it shows, I'd say, very clear ignorance. Now, you don't have to accept it, but I would suggest that you get a copy of Josephus, a PDF for free online, and make the comparisons for yourself. You don't have to believe me, but you do need to take me seriously, because I'm presenting you with a very strong prima facie case that needs to be investigated if you are a real digger. If your faith is not strong enough, then you can just turn me off and reject it out of hand and call it irrational or something like that. But a true person after the truth would investigate this. Now, we're about to start chapter 15 of Menescott's book. It's called Could the AP-TVS Pattern Result from a Biased Selection of Parallels? The title of this chapter poses a question that the reader may reasonably have had while reading thus far. I fully realize that humans are prone to falsely identifying patterns in noise, usually unintentionally and sometimes even intentionally, so I will address this here. In an ideal world, we could evaluate the chances that this extreme number of noteworthy parallels would not only occur in the two most important first century documents, but would be preferentially arranged to form a complex series of lines forming a word in a popular language of the empire, which have religious relevance to help promote faith in Flavian emperor worship, that is, the worship of Titus and his father Vespasian, who incidentally were both deified by the Roman Senate. So in the Roman Empire, Vespasian and Titus literally are gods. And in many cases would present riddles pointing to hidden messages relating to Flavian emperor worship. It is difficult enough producing a way to objectively assess whether a particular parallel should be considered noteworthy. So whatever statistical methods might be capable of addressing such a question are far beyond my abilities. So instead I will focus on small subsets of the available evidence that are easier to analyze. I'll approach this from two angles as follows. 1. Evaluating how much of Jewish war would need to be filled with unintended parallels with Luke. I'll keep in mind that the book of Luke he's found 250 plus parallels, and he admits that there are probably a lot more that he didn't find. The book of Luke itself only has 1,181 verses. So that means that in less than 1 out of 5, 1 out of 4.7 verses of the book of Luke, there is a parallel. So that's a lot. That's, it's over 10 per chapter. I will use the very thin and densely populated right-hand edge of the A to show that if I had faked the APTVS signature by selecting unintended parallels, there would need to be about 2,000 notable yet unintended parallels in which Jewish war appears to parody Luke for it to be possible for me to select such a clearly defined pattern. You can see the pattern on the thumbnail for this video, the APTVS pattern in total. Each of those 2,000 notable parallels would have had to have occurred simply as coincidences, and they would fill roughly 5,000 sentences. However, Jewish war only has somewhat under 5,000 sentences, which exposes the absurdity of the scenario. In summary, the number of unintended and coincidental yet noteworthy parallels there would need to be for such a well-defined pattern to be picked out would essentially fill the entirety of Jewish war to the point that there wouldn't be space for much else. And his second point is evaluating how much of Luke would need to be filled with unintended parallels with Jewish war. I will then use the densely populated lines around the V to show that if I had faked the signature by selecting unintended parallels, there would need to be about 2,000 notable yet unintended parallels in which Luke appears to parody Jewish war, in turn filling over 4,000 verses of Luke. This is physically impossible since Luke only has 1,151 verses. So that's one every 4.6 verses. And it's actually more than 250, so it's probably like 4.5 verses. Here, the number of unintended and coincidental yet noteworthy parallels there would need to be for me to have selected them to create such a well-defined pattern is so great that they could not possibly fit into the Gospel of Luke. Taken together, this analysis will show that I cannot be guilty of finding a pattern in noise, inadvertently or otherwise, because there just isn't enough content to contain enough noise to pick out such a detailed and densely populated pattern. I think I'm following that, but it's a little bit. You know, I'm not going to critique it, because I'm sure he's gotten these critiques, and he's answering critiques that he's like literally gotten. So, okay, detail of my approach. In how many places would Jewish war need to contain unintentional parallels seeming to parody Luke? I begin by noting that the APTVS signature has evenly spaced, equal-sized Latin letters, as shown on the right. So he shows that the letters are equally spaced. Now you can see how the V and the S are much more defined than the A and the P, and the T is kind of a little bit in the middle. And you know, the blue letters, the blue dots are where Jesus is parodying War of the Jews, and the black dots are where War of the Jews is parodying the Gospels. Okay, this is important because it shows that there is very little room for maneuver to place the line at a different location or angle. The right-hand side of the A has to be in that location and have that angle, otherwise it does not fit the rest of the text. The line of parallels I have described has 32 parallels and an R-squared value of 98%. He doesn't really go into the R-squared, that's a statistical analysis, but he's not really explaining it. Maybe it's in a footnote, but we'll see. In the observed line, a few parallels are less well aligned than the rest. If I were faking it, I probably would have chosen to ignore the 4 least aligned parallels to give me an even more straight line containing 28 parallels with a more impressive R-squared value of 99%, a point that I will come back to later. I accordingly ran a simulation to find out whether such a line could be faked if there happened to be 2,000 unintentional parallels where Jewish war coincidentally appears to parody Luke. An example of this is also shown to the right as a line of orange dots. Here I will assume that unintentional parallels would occur at random. This is a simplification. However, at the end of this discussion, I will explain why it strengthens my analysis rather than weakens it. The hypothetical scenario with 2,000 random parallels is shown in this simulation on the right, where I configured the simulation to automatically highlight those that appeared on that line plus or minus 1.5 chapters of Luke, the orange dots. As can be seen, now another criticism that people have made, which doesn't stand up at all, is that, you know, the Bible didn't have verse numbers and chapter numbers in its original form. It doesn't matter for the purposes of this analysis, because even if you measured it by chapter or by word or any other metric, it would still fit the same pattern. It would be maybe slightly distorted in one way or another, but it would still fit the APTVS pattern even if you didn't use chapters of Luke and paragraphs of War of the Jews. If you just used words or letters or any other metric, it would still fit the same pattern. As can be seen in the simulation, the simulated line failed to achieve the quality of the observed line in the APTVS pattern, instead resulting in a line of only 20 orange dots. I don't quite get that, but since there is a small degree of freedom to choose a line to complete the A at a slightly different position or angle, this effectively gives me multiple tries to see whether having several tries could result in a line with the observed characteristics. I reran the simulation repeatedly. Okay, sorry, I got to flip the page here, which can be an adventure. Okay, the 7 charts with orange lines below show 7 such attempts. All but one of them produced a line with too few dots, and even the one resulting in enough dots failed to have the observed degree of alignment, the R squared value, seen in the observed line. In an effort to be more systematic, I then ran the simulation a further 40 times as follows. 20 times, each time requiring alignment to plus or minus 1.5 chapters of Luke, and another 20 times but requiring alignment to plus or minus 2 chapters of Luke, which tended to produce lines with more parallels but poor alignment. The results are shown on the right. None of the simulations resulted in a pattern enabling a line to be picked out that had both the number of dots and the degree of linear alignment, as is observed in the right-hand edge of the APTVS pattern. I now return to explain why, if I had been faking the line, I would have deleted 4 of the parallels that were less aligned than the rest. The reason is that this would have achieved an even straighter line with an R-squared value of 99%. That such a remarkable alignment could so easily be located in a subset of the observed data is interesting because none of the 40 simulations produced a line with an R-squared value of 99%. So, is it feasible that if there were 2,000 unintentional yet noteworthy parallels between the 2 stories, one could pick out a line that is equal in number and alignment to the line seen on the right-hand side of the APTVS pattern? Despite a little freedom to select a slightly different angle and position, you probably wouldn't succeed, but it's not impossible. Therefore, we can conclude that at least 2,000 unintentional but noteworthy parallels would need to exist between the 2 stories in which Jewish war would appear to conceptually mirror Luke, for such a line as observed to have been selected. And is it a plausible scenario that there are 2,000 notable yet unintentional parallels where Jewish war appears to mirror Luke in this manner? Where Jewish war is parodying Luke, each notable parallel usually involves multiple sentences of Jewish war, averaging around 2 or 3 sentences. So, for Jewish war to contain